"Do not touch the body," the royal physician whispered, his voice breaking just enough to silence the grand hall. "If this was murder, the killer wants us to see exactly what we are seeing." Every conversation inside the imperial palace stopped at once. Servants froze where they stood. Royal guards lowered their eyes. Advisors who had spent decades arguing over treaties suddenly had nothing to say. Queen Celeste Arden, the most respected monarch in the Orion Dominion, was gone. She sat peacefully in the reading chair inside her private library, as though she had simply closed the final page of her favorite novel. A crystal teacup rested beside her untouched. The morning sunlight poured through towering stained-glass windows, painting soft colors across polished marble floors. There were no broken doors, no overturned furniture, no obvious signs of struggle. Everything looked exactly as it should have. That was what frightened everyone. Within minutes, palace security sealed the entire East Wing. The Royal Investigation Bureau arrived with portable scanners, forensic drones, and enough advanced equipment to map every inch of the room down to microscopic particles. Their lead investigator, Commander Lyron Voss, folded his arms confidently as glowing holograms floated around him. No forced entry, no foreign DNA, no unauthorized energy signatures. The evidence speaks for itself. Around him, alien officers nodded with quiet satisfaction. Someone inside the palace had betrayed the queen. They simply needed to identify which member of the royal family benefited the most. Outside the library, reporters gathered behind security barriers while citizens watched live broadcasts with growing disbelief. Across the empire, millions demanded answers before sunset. The council wanted a suspect before panic spread. The palace wanted this nightmare to end as quickly as possible. That was exactly why Daniel Brooks hated cases like this. Daniel arrived nearly 40 minutes after everyone else. He carried no futuristic scanner, no glowing equipment, no dramatic entrance. Just a worn leather notebook, a ballpoint pen, and a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. At 39 years old, the former Chicago homicide detective had spent nearly 15 years walking into rooms where everyone believed the answers were obvious. Most of the time, they were wrong. An officer intercepted him outside the library entrance. "Human consultant?" Daniel nodded. "Daniel Brooks." The officer hesitated before stepping aside. "The commander says there isn't much left for you to examine." Daniel offered a polite smile. "Funny. That's usually when I become useful." Inside the library, dozens of investigators carefully documented every shelf, every chair, every decorative sculpture. Commander Voss barely glanced at Daniel. "Try not to disturb the professionals." Daniel ignored the remark. Instead of looking at the queen, he slowly turned in a complete circle. He listened. Old habits. Every room had its own rhythm. Air circulation, floor creaks, lighting. Silence could tell its own story if someone bothered to hear it. His eyes settled on the fireplace, then the bookshelves, then the untouched teacup. Finally, they stopped near one of the enormous windows overlooking the palace gardens. He walked toward it without saying a word. Behind him, Voss sounded almost amused. "The body is over here, human." Daniel remained focused on the window. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not impossible, just wrong in the quiet way that real crime scenes often were. His fingers brushed the wooden frame before stopping beside a tiny streak of pale golden dust resting where morning sunlight struck the edge of the glass. It was so small that every scanner in the room had ignored it. Daniel rubbed the dust between two fingers, studying it for only a second before slipping his hand into his pocket. Then he looked back at the queen for the first time. His expression never changed. "Whoever did this," he said quietly, "wanted all of you looking at her." The room fell silent again. Because the real clue, Daniel looked back toward the window, was never supposed to be found. Commander Lyron Voss stared at Daniel for several long seconds before letting out a quiet laugh that echoed across the silent library. "You crossed an entire star system to tell us there is dust on a window." Several investigators chuckled politely. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he removed a clean evidence envelope from his jacket, carefully collected the tiny golden particles, sealed them, and slipped the envelope back into his pocket. "You already have your evidence," Voss said confidently. The queen drank tea shortly before she passed away. There are no signs of forced entry, no hidden passages, no unidentified biological traces. Every forensic model reaches the same conclusion. Daniel finally looked at him. Then why are you still standing here? The question caught the entire room off guard. Voss frowned. Excuse me. If your conclusion is complete, why keep searching? Daniel asked calmly. Because something about this room still bothers you. You just have not admitted it yet. The commander folded his arms. Our scanners have analyzed every square inch. Daniel slowly walked toward the large reading desk. Every object had already been tagged with glowing evidence markers. Books remained neatly stacked. A silver bookmark rested inside an unfinished novel. A pair of reading glasses lay exactly parallel to the edge of the desk. Everything looked carefully arranged, almost too carefully. Daniel leaned closer to the untouched teacup. He never picked it up. He simply watched the reflection dancing across the surface. Did anyone ask who prepared her breakfast? One officer answered immediately. The kitchen staff has already been interviewed. Did anyone ask who washed this cup yesterday? Silence. What about the servant who polished this table? More silence. Daniel nodded slightly. People focus on the last person who enters a room. Experienced killers think much earlier than that. Voss sighed impatiently. You still believe someone staged this entire scene? Daniel glanced around the enormous library once more. No. The commander raised an eyebrow. I believe someone expected all of you to solve it exactly the way you are solving it now. Across the room, one of the younger forensic technicians quietly approached. She wore the blue insignia of the Royal Science Division and looked uncertain about interrupting. Commander, there is something you should probably see. Voss accepted her data tablet with visible annoyance. His expression slowly changed. Impossible. Daniel remained where he stood. What did your scanner miss? The technician swallowed. The palace environmental system recorded microscopic airborne pollen entering this room approximately 23 minutes before the Queen was discovered. Voss immediately answered. The windows were closed. Exactly, Daniel replied before the technician could speak. The commander looked back toward the enormous glass windows. Our atmospheric seals show no breach. Daniel walked over to the fireplace instead. Above the stone mantel hung a massive family portrait painted nearly 40 years earlier. He studied it quietly before speaking again. Every investigator brings assumptions into a crime scene. Humans do it. Aliens do it. The difference is that good investigators learn which assumptions to question first. Voss watched him carefully now. The confidence from earlier had faded. Daniel reached into his notebook and sketched a rough outline of the library in only a few seconds. Then he placed a single mark beside the window, another beside the fireplace, a third beside the Queen's chair. The killer never entered through the door, he said quietly. But they also never climbed through the window. One of the officers looked confused. Then how did they get inside? Daniel closed the notebook. That is the wrong question. The room became silent once again. Ask instead, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why someone wanted every investigator to waste the first hour looking for a way in when the real answer has been sitting inside this room the entire time. By late afternoon, the palace had already decided who would take the blame. News channels across the empire displayed the same headline over and over. Prince Adrian Vale, the Queen's only surviving nephew, had become the center of every conversation. His financial disagreements with several members of the Royal Council had been leaked within hours. Anonymous officials claimed he had argued with his aunt just 2 nights before. To the public, the story fit together almost too well. Inside the palace, Daniel watched investigators move with renewed confidence. They were no longer looking for answers. They were collecting confirmation. Commander Lyron Voss stood before a holographic display filled with timelines, financial records, and security logs. The prince had motive. He had access. His personal security clearance allowed unrestricted movement throughout the East Wing. Every piece of evidence points in one direction. Daniel quietly looked through the display without saying a word. Voss noticed his expression. You disagree? Daniel nodded once. I do. Then tell me what we missed. Daniel stepped closer to the projection and pointed toward the timeline. Nothing. Voss frowned. Nothing. That is exactly the problem. Daniel tapped the floating screen with one finger. Every piece of evidence agrees with every other piece of evidence. Real investigations almost never work that way. One of the younger officers looked puzzled. Why not? Daniel smiled faintly. Because people are messy. They forget things. They panic. They make mistakes. Perfect stories usually come from someone who had time to write them. The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel continued studying the timeline. Every camera showed Prince Adrian entering the Queen's private wing shortly before sunrise. Every access log matched. Every witness remembered seeing him. Even the digital records lined up down to the second. It was flawless. Too flawless. Daniel looked at Voss. Who verified the security system? The Royal Technical Division. Independent audit? Not necessary. Daniel slipped both hands into his jacket pockets. Back in Chicago, whenever everything looked perfect, I learned to stop trusting perfect. Voss crossed his arms. Human intuition is not evidence. No, Daniel answered calmly. But experience tells me where evidence is hiding. Before anyone could respond, 2 royal guards entered the library. Between them walked Prince Adrian himself. He wore a dark ceremonial jacket without any royal decorations. His hands were free, but the expressions on the guards' faces made it obvious he was no longer treated like family. Adrian looked exhausted rather than frightened. He noticed Daniel standing near the evidence table. You are the human investigator. Daniel nodded. Daniel Brooks. Adrian gave a tired smile that barely lasted a second. I suppose everyone believes I did this. Nobody answered. The silence was answer enough. Adrian looked around the room, where he had spent countless afternoons reading with his aunt. His eyes rested on the empty chair beside the fireplace. She taught me how to read ancient star maps in that corner when I was 8 years old. His voice remained steady, but Daniel heard something the others seemed to miss. There was grief. There was regret. There was exhaustion. There was no trace of fear. Daniel had interviewed hundreds of suspects over the years. Innocent people worried about being believed. Guilty people worried about being caught. Adrian sounded like a man mourning someone he had truly loved. Voss interrupted. Where were you between 6:30 and 7 o'clock this morning? Adrian answered immediately. Walking through the East Garden. The cameras disagree. Adrian looked genuinely confused. Then your cameras are wrong. Voss almost smiled. Machines rarely lie. Daniel finally spoke. Machines do not lie. People teach them what to believe. Every face in the room turned toward him. Daniel walked slowly toward the palace window where he had found the golden dust. He stared out across the gardens below. Commander, he said quietly, do not arrest the prince today. Voss narrowed his eyes. Give me one reason. Daniel never looked away from the window. Because if he goes to prison tonight, the real killer will sleep better than they have in weeks. Daniel Brooks did not leave the palace that evening. Instead, he asked for something Commander Lyron Voss considered ridiculous. I want the maintenance records for every room connected to the Queen's library during the last 30 days. Voss looked up from his terminal. You believe the answer is hidden in plumbing reports? Daniel shrugged. I believe people who plan carefully usually leave paperwork behind. The commander let out a slow breath before handing the request to a nearby officer. Fine. While you read maintenance logs, we will continue investigating actual suspects. Daniel smiled politely. That is why we make a good team. Nearly an hour later, the palace archives delivered hundreds of digital records. Air filtration schedules, lighting inspections, window seal replacements, climate control adjustments. Most investigators would have ignored them. Daniel spread the files across a conference table inside a quiet records room and began reading one line at a time. He had learned years ago that solving murders was rarely about finding dramatic evidence. It was about noticing the one boring detail everyone else skipped. As midnight approached, someone knocked softly on the open door. A gray-haired palace groundskeeper stepped inside, holding his cap nervously in both hands. Excuse me, sir. One of the officers said you wanted to speak with anyone who worked near the East Gardens. Daniel stood and offered him a chair. Thank you for coming. What is your name? Walter Hayes. Daniel smiled. That is an Earth name. Walter nodded. My grandfather worked with human diplomats decades ago. He liked the names. The family kept them. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee from a small machine sitting against the wall. Walter accepted one with both hands. I do not know if I can help. Just tell me what you remember. Walter looked down at the steaming cup. The morning before the Queen was found, I noticed someone walking along the rose terraces before sunrise. Daniel waited. Silence often encouraged better memories than another question. Walter continued. It was unusual because the palace gardeners do not begin until 7 o'clock. Whoever it was moved slowly, almost like they wanted to avoid being noticed. Did you recognize them? Walter hesitated. No. The hood covered most of the face. But I remember the shoes. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Tell me about the shoes. They were polished. Too polished for a gardener. They reflected the lights along the path. Daniel wrote a single sentence inside his notebook. Then he asked, "Did anyone else see this?" Walter nodded once. Old Miriam did. Who is Miriam? Walter's expression changed. She has taken care of the palace greenhouse for almost 40 years. Nothing escapes her eyes. Daniel closed the notebook. Where can I find her? Walter looked uncomfortable. That is the strange part. Go on. She has not reported to work since this morning. Daniel frowned. Has anyone checked on her? Walter slowly shook his head. Everyone has been focused on the investigation. Daniel stood immediately. Where does she live? 20 minutes later, Daniel and Walter arrived at a small stone cottage tucked behind the palace botanical gardens. Warm lights still glowed through the windows. Flower boxes lined the porch exactly as though someone had cared for them only hours earlier. Daniel knocked twice. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Walter quietly reached for the spare key hidden beneath a clay planter. The front door opened without resistance. The little house was neat. Fresh tea still sat on the kitchen table. Reading glasses rested beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. A sweater hung neatly over the back of a wooden chair. Nothing looked disturbed. Daniel slowly walked through the silent home until he reached a hallway lined with framed photographs from decades of royal ceremonies. He stopped in front of one empty picture hook on the wall. Dust outlined where a frame had hung for years. The photograph was gone. Daniel looked back toward Walter. She did not leave in a hurry. Walter swallowed. Then where is she? Daniel stared at the empty space on the wall for several quiet seconds before answering. I think someone made sure she could not tell us what she saw. Daniel returned to the palace before sunrise carrying nothing except his notebook and the unanswered questions that had kept him awake all night. Commander Lyron Voss was already waiting inside the Security Operations Center with several senior officers gathered around a massive holographic display. The council has approved the arrest warrant, Voss said without looking up. Prince Adrian will be taken into custody by noon. Daniel set his notebook on the table. Then you have less than 6 hours to stop arresting the wrong man. Voss finally met his eyes. Do you have proof? Not yet. Then I have politics to deal with. Daniel nodded. And that is exactly why someone built this case for you. Without waiting for permission, he walked toward the central display showing the palace infrastructure. Hundreds of maintenance reports floated across the screen. Ventilation shafts, electrical grids, environmental controls, cleaning schedules. Everything looked ordinary until Daniel began filtering the records by date instead of department. A strange pattern slowly appeared. The Queen's Library had experienced 3 unrelated maintenance requests during the previous 4 weeks. One involved the climate control system. Another involved the fireplace ventilation. The last concerned the eastern window seals. 3 different departments. 3 different technicians. 3 different explanations. Daniel pointed at the screen. Has anyone confirmed these repairs actually happened? One technician answered. The paperwork says they did. Daniel smiled faintly. Paperwork says a lot of things. He requested access to the technician's entry logs. Several officers exchanged confused glances as the records appeared. Daniel studied them quietly before asking another question. How many employees are authorized to approve maintenance requests? More than 60, one administrator replied. How many approve these 3 jobs? The administrator typed rapidly before stopping. Only one. Daniel looked toward Voss. Name. The administrator hesitated. Chief of Royal Facilities. Marcus Dorian. Voss immediately shook his head. Impossible. Dorian has served the palace for 22 years. Daniel closed the distance between them. That makes him trusted, not innocent. The room fell silent. Daniel requested every surveillance recording connected to those maintenance visits. One by one, the videos appeared. The first showed workers entering the hallway outside the library. The second showed equipment carts leaving several hours later. The third was missing entirely. Where is the final recording? Daniel asked. A security officer frowned at his console. It says the archive file was corrupted during a routine system update. Daniel looked around the room. Convenient. Voss folded his arms. Data corruption happens. 3 weeks before the Queen dies? Daniel replied. Maybe. But coincidences are expensive. Someone usually pays for them. Just then, the young forensic technician who had discovered the airborne pollen rushed into the operations center carrying another data tablet. She looked visibly nervous. Commander, I reran the environmental logs after what Mr. Brooks said yesterday. Voss turned toward her. And the pollen did not enter through the library window. Daniel slowly looked up. Where did it come from? She enlarged a three-dimensional airflow model. Tiny glowing particles drifted through invisible ventilation ducts before settling near the Queen's chair and the window where Daniel had found the golden dust. The ventilation system carried it into the room. Daniel stared at the model without speaking. The room around him disappeared as the pieces finally began fitting together. The maintenance requests, the missing surveillance recording, the fireplace, the ventilation ducts. None of it had been random. Someone had quietly altered the building itself long before anyone discovered the Queen. Voss walked closer to the display, his confidence beginning to crack. If someone modified the ventilation network, Daniel finished the sentence for him. Then they did not simply plan a murder. They redesigned the crime scene weeks before it happened. Every officer in the room stopped talking. Daniel picked up his notebook and quietly wrote a single name across the next blank page. He closed the cover before anyone could read it. For the first time since entering the palace, he was no longer searching for how the crime had happened. He was searching for why someone inside the palace had spent an entire month preparing the perfect lie. Daniel spent the next 2 hours following a trail that no one else believed existed. Every maintenance request connected to the library had been approved by Marcus Dorian, but the signatures alone were not enough. Trusted people signed paperwork every day. Daniel wanted the reason behind the paperwork. He found Marcus inside the royal facilities office reviewing repair schedules as though the palace had not become the center of the biggest investigation in imperial history. Marcus looked up with a polite smile. He was in his late 50s, neatly dressed, calm, and completely unremarkable. Exactly the kind of man people stopped noticing after years of seeing him in the same halls. "Mr. Brooks," Marcus said pleasantly. "What can I do for you?" Daniel remained standing. "I have a few questions about the work completed near the Queen's library." Marcus folded his hands on the desk. "Of course." Daniel placed 3 maintenance records side by side. Climate control, fireplace ventilation, window seal replacement. All approved by you. Marcus barely glanced at them. "Routine maintenance. Did you inspect the work personally?" "No. I delegated it." "To whom?" Marcus turned toward his terminal. "I would have to check." Daniel watched his face instead of the screen. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was long enough. Marcus was buying time. "Take your time," Daniel said calmly. Marcus finally answered. "A subcontractor from the palace maintenance pool." "Name?" Another pause. "I do not remember." Daniel nodded as though that answer satisfied him. "Interesting." Marcus looked up. "Why is that interesting?" Daniel smiled politely. "Because most people remember the unusual jobs. Replacing a window seal in the Queen's private library is not exactly fixing a hallway light." Marcus remained silent. Daniel gathered the records and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped. "One more thing." Marcus looked up again. "Yes." "Who ordered the repairs?" Marcus answered immediately this time. "The Queen herself." Daniel simply nodded and walked out. Halfway down the corridor, he pulled out his phone and called Commander Lyron Voss. "Can you verify something for me?" "What?" "Find out whether Queen Celeste personally approved those maintenance requests." There was a brief pause before Voss answered. "That should only take a few minutes." Daniel ended the call and continued walking toward the palace archives. 20 minutes later, his communicator vibrated. Voss sounded different. Less certain. "The Queen never signed those requests." Daniel stopped walking. "Who did?" "Her executive secretary approved them using delegated authority." "Where is the secretary now?" Silence filled the line. Finally, Voss answered quietly. "She resigned 6 days before the Queen died." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. The puzzle was growing larger. Someone had arranged repairs that the Queen never requested. Someone had altered the ventilation system. Someone had erased surveillance footage. Someone had disappeared before the investigation even began. None of it pointed to Prince Adrian anymore. It pointed toward planning. Long, careful planning. Daniel reached the archive level and requested personnel files for every employee connected to the maintenance projects. As the records loaded, one file immediately caught his attention. A temporary contractor listed on the ventilation project had only worked inside the palace for 3 days. His employment records ended without explanation. No forwarding address. No tax records after the project. No departure interview. It was as though he had existed just long enough to complete one assignment before disappearing completely. Daniel quietly copied the file onto his tablet. Behind him, he heard footsteps approaching. A young palace clerk hurried down the hallway, breathing hard. "Mr. Brooks," she called. "Commander Voss has been looking everywhere for you." Daniel turned. "Why?" The clerk struggled to catch her breath. "Someone just tried to access the evidence vault using your authorization code." Daniel's expression did not change, but his heartbeat quickened. He had never shared that code with anyone, which meant one thing. Whoever had spent weeks constructing the perfect crime scene had finally realized the human investigator was getting too close. Daniel arrived at the evidence vault less than 3 minutes after receiving the warning. Commander Lyron Voss was already there with 2 royal guards standing outside the reinforced security door. The commander looked frustrated. "The access attempt failed," he said. "The system recognized the authorization code but rejected the biometric confirmation." Daniel nodded. "Who discovered it?" "Night security." "Show me the logs." Voss projected the security records into the air. Daniel read them carefully. The attempt had lasted exactly 9 seconds before the system locked itself. No forced entry. No alarms beyond the authentication failure. Whoever tried knew exactly how the vault operated. They simply did not have Daniel's fingerprint. "Only 3 people knew I was reviewing the maintenance files today," Daniel said quietly. "You, the archives clerk, and whoever has been watching this investigation." Voss looked at him. "You think someone is following your movements inside the palace?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I stopped believing in coincidence about 2 days ago." The evidence vault was opened under strict supervision. Every sealed container remained in place. The envelope holding the tiny golden dust still rested exactly where Daniel had left it. So did the environmental reports and the maintenance records. Nothing had been stolen. That bothered Daniel more than if something had disappeared. Voss noticed his expression. "Everything is still here." "Exactly," Daniel replied. "They were not trying to take evidence." "Then why break in?" Daniel slowly closed the storage case. "To learn which evidence worries me." The realization settled over the room like cold air. Someone inside the palace wanted to know how far the human investigator had progressed. Daniel carefully removed the envelope containing the golden particles and slipped it into his inside pocket. "From now on, this stays with me." As they exited the vault, the young forensic technician hurried toward them once again. Her name badge read Emily Carter. She looked both nervous and determined. "Mr. Brooks, I think I found something you should see." Daniel followed her into the forensic laboratory where dozens of scanners quietly processed evidence collected throughout the palace. Emily enlarged a microscopic image onto the central display. The golden dust appeared as thousands of tiny crystal fragments. "At first I thought it was pollen," she admitted. "It is not." Daniel stepped closer. "What is it?" "Decorative mineral powder. It is mixed into ceremonial paint used only during royal restoration projects." Daniel frowned. "Where is it normally stored?" Emily pulled up another file. "Inside the old restoration workshop beneath the West Wing." Voss looked confused. "That workshop has been closed for almost 15 years. Daniel immediately turned toward him. "Who has access?" "Very few people," Voss answered. "Mostly facilities management." Daniel did not need to hear another word. 20 minutes later, they descended narrow stone stairs beneath the palace. The old restoration workshop smelled of aged wood, paint, and dust that had settled over forgotten decades. Shelves filled with antique tools lined the walls. Most had not been touched in years. Daniel walked slowly through the room until he reached an old ventilation access panel hidden behind stacked wooden crates. The screws securing the panel looked newer than everything around them. He crouched beside it. "Commander." Voss joined him. "What is it?" Daniel pointed toward the polished screw heads. "Somebody opened this recently." Voss carefully removed the panel. Behind it stretched a narrow maintenance passage leading directly toward the Queen's private library. Emily quietly checked the airflow schematics on her tablet. Her eyes widened. "This duct connects to the fireplace ventilation system." Daniel looked into the darkness of the passage for several silent seconds. The entire investigation suddenly felt different. This had never been about finding one hidden entrance. It was about discovering who possessed enough authority to quietly reshape the palace itself without raising suspicion. He slowly stood and brushed the dust from his hands. "The killer did not hide behind technology," he said. "They hid behind trust." Commander Voss looked back toward the ancient passage, and for the first time since the investigation began, he spoke without a trace of certainty. Daniel, how many people inside this palace could have done that? Daniel stared down the empty corridor before answering in a calm voice that made everyone around him uneasy. Far fewer than we thought, and much closer than any of us wanted to believe. The Royal Council chamber had never been so quiet. Representatives from every noble house filled the circular hall while news networks broadcast the emergency hearing across the empire. Prince Adrian Vale stood beneath the central platform surrounded by royal guards, waiting to hear whether he would officially become the man blamed for the Queen's death. Commander Lyron Voss stepped to the center first. Based on the evidence collected during the initial investigation, Prince Adrian remains our primary suspect. Before another word could be spoken, Daniel Brooks quietly stood from the back row. Then your investigation is incomplete. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the human. Council Speaker Helena Soren frowned. Mr. Brooks, you requested this hearing. If you intend to challenge the findings of the Royal Investigation Bureau, now is your opportunity. Daniel walked toward the center of the chamber, carrying nothing except his leather notebook. No holograms. No dramatic presentation. He stopped beside Prince Adrian before looking around the room. May I ask a simple question? No one answered. Daniel continued anyway. How many of you believe Prince Adrian was guilty before you ever looked at the evidence? Several council members shifted uncomfortably. Daniel nodded. That is what I thought. Commander Voss crossed his arms. This is not philosophy. Present your case. Daniel looked directly at him. I am. He opened the notebook and placed a rough hand-drawn sketch of the Queen's library onto the central table. Every investigation begins with one dangerous assumption. You assumed the crime scene told the truth. He pointed toward the window. The golden dust was not pollen. It came from an abandoned restoration workshop. Then he pointed toward the fireplace. The ventilation system had been quietly modified weeks before the Queen died. Finally, he tapped the maintenance records. Those repairs were approved using authority the Queen never gave. Murmurs spread throughout the chamber. Daniel remained calm. Now let us talk about Prince Adrian. He looked toward the young royal. Every piece of evidence against him was perfect. Security records, access logs, witnesses, digital timelines. Perfect. Daniel slowly closed the notebook. Real life is never perfect. Council Speaker Helena leaned forward. What are you suggesting? Daniel answered without hesitation. Someone spent weeks constructing a story that all of you would believe before asking a single difficult question. Commander Voss interrupted. Then name the killer. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. The room erupted with frustrated voices. Helena struck the ceremonial staff against the floor until silence returned. You asked for this hearing. If you cannot identify the guilty party, why are we here? Daniel looked around the chamber one face at a time. Because the wrong man was about to lose everything while the right one sat comfortably inside this room. Silence fell again. Daniel reached into his jacket and removed the sealed evidence envelope containing the golden mineral dust. He handed it to Emily Carter, who immediately placed the microscopic analysis onto the chamber display. The crystal structure matched samples collected beneath the abandoned West Wing workshop exactly. Daniel spoke softly. The killer wanted investigators staring at the Queen. I looked at the building instead. Then he turned toward Marcus Dorian, Chief of Royal Facilities, who had remained unusually quiet throughout the hearing. Daniel noticed something almost invisible. Marcus was not watching the evidence. He was watching the nearest exit. Daniel smiled almost sadly. After 15 years solving murders in Chicago, he had seen that look before. It was never fear of being accused. It was fear that the plan had finally stopped working. Daniel closed his notebook and met Marcus's eyes across the chamber. There is only one question left, he said calmly. Why did you spend an entire month preparing the palace for one single morning? Marcus Dorian did not answer immediately. He remained perfectly still as every member of the Royal Council turned toward him. Then, almost surprisingly, he smiled. It was not the smile of a cornered criminal. It was the tired smile of someone who finally understood the game was over. You are different from the others, Marcus said quietly, looking only at Daniel. They trusted machines. You trusted people. Daniel stood calmly across from him. People always leave traces, not fingerprints. Choices. Marcus lowered his head for a moment before looking toward the council speaker. Everything Mr. Brooks has presented is true. A wave of disbelief swept through the chamber. Commander Lyron Voss stared at Marcus without speaking. Prince Adrian simply closed his eyes in relief. Marcus slowly removed a small access badge from his jacket and placed it on the council table. I approved every maintenance request. I arranged the restoration work beneath the West Wing. I made certain the investigation would begin exactly where I wanted it to begin. Helena Soren's voice remained steady despite the shock spreading across the chamber. Why? Marcus looked toward the empty royal throne. Because Queen Celeste intended to sign the Unity Charter. Several council members immediately looked at one another. Daniel had never heard those words before, but he recognized their importance from the faces around him. Marcus continued. The charter would have removed hereditary control over planetary resources. Noble houses would answer to elected governors. Royal privilege would become public service. The Queen believed the empire had grown too powerful for too few families. Silence settled over the chamber once again. Some believed she was destroying centuries of tradition. Marcus said, I believed I was protecting it. Daniel finally spoke. You convinced yourself that preserving the empire mattered more than preserving the woman who was trying to save it. Marcus never argued. History is filled with people who believe they were heroes. Daniel nodded slowly. And history usually remembers the cost instead. Royal guards quietly stepped forward. Marcus offered no resistance as they escorted him from the chamber. He paused only once, turning back toward Daniel. How did you know? Daniel answered with the same calm voice he had carried since arriving at the palace. Because you built a perfect story. Real life is never perfect. After Marcus disappeared through the great doors, the council officially cleared Prince Adrian of every accusation. Commander Lyron Voss walked over to Daniel and extended his hand. I owe you an apology. Daniel shook it gently. You do not owe me anything. Voss looked confused. I dismissed every instinct you had. Daniel smiled. So did half the homicide detectives I worked with in Chicago. Good investigators argue. Better investigators learn. A few days later, the palace library reopened. The Queen's chair remained exactly where it had always been. Her favorite unfinished novel rested on the same wooden table beside a fresh cup of tea that would never be touched. Daniel stood alone inside the quiet room before preparing to leave the capital forever. Emily Carter approached carrying a small sealed envelope. The palace archivist found this hidden inside the Queen's private desk after the investigation ended. Daniel carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten note dated nearly 3 months before her death. There was only one sentence. When everyone sees what they expect to see, ask the one who still knows how to look. Daniel folded the note and quietly slipped it into his notebook. As he walked out beneath the morning sunlight, palace workers, royal guards, and even members of the council stepped aside without a word. They had once believed humans relied on simple tools and old-fashioned instincts because they lacked better technology. Now they understood something far more important. Wisdom does not begin with having the smartest machine in the room. It begins with having the humility to question the story everyone else is too comfortable believing. And from that day forward, every major royal investigation across the empire began with one simple rule written beneath the seal of Queen Celeste Arden. Before you trust the evidence, make certain you have not mistaken a perfect story for the truth.